there is a view that millions of people have stood in front of and called beautiful. A sweep of bare hillside, rolling upward through heather and bracken, the color of rust and purple in autumn light, the color of ash in winter, the sky enormous above it. No trees, no shade, just the open land climbing toward a ridge that looks, from a certain angle, like the spine of something ancient. People take photographs of this view. They put it on postcards. They build holiday cottages to face it. They call it wilderness. It is not wilderness. It has not been wilderness for thousands of years. What you are looking at when you stand before a bare Scottish hillside, a Welsh mountain flank, a Lake District fell, a stretch of Dartmoor or the Pennine Moors, is the aftermath of one of the longest and most complete ecological destructions ever carried out by human beings on any landscape on Earth. You are looking at what is left. You are looking at the bones. And the bones themselves are older than almost anything you can imagine standing on. The rocks beneath your feet on a Scottish mountain are not just old in the way that history is old. They are old in a way that makes all of human civilization, all of recorded time, every dynasty and empire and language that has ever existed, into a thin film of recent sediment at the very top of a column of deep time that goes down for hundreds of millions of years. The mountains of Britain are not old mountains. They are old rocks that were once part of mountains so colossal that they would have dwarfed the Himalayas, mountains that are now gone, ground down by time and weather and the slow, patient work of water, until what remains is the root structure, the basement, the stumps of something that was once among the highest landforms on the planet. This film is about those two truths at once. The geological truth, that what we call the mountains of Britain are the deeply eroded remnants of ranges built and destroyed across hundreds of millions of years of tectonic violence. And the ecological truth, that whatever survived those geological processes, whatever forests and wildlands grew across those ancient roots, was then systematically stripped and burned and grazed and cleared by human beings over 6,000 years, until almost nothing of the original living cover remained. It is a story about scale, about the difference between what a landscape is and what it looks like. About memory, and how a land holds memory in ways that go deeper than any written record. And it is a story about what happens when a culture loses its sense of what a place was supposed to be and mistakes the wreckage for the original. If you want to understand land in a way that most people never will, subscribe to this channel now. We go into the deep history of landscape, the kind of knowledge that changes how you see every hill and valley you will ever walk through again. Hit the subscribe button and the bell so you do not miss a single video. To understand what Britain's mountains actually are, you have to start before Britain existed. You have to start around 500 million years ago, in a world that looks nothing like the one we know, on a planet whose surface was arranged in configurations so different from today's that if you could somehow fly over it, you would not recognize a single feature. There were no Atlantic Ocean and no North Sea. The land masses that would eventually become Scotland and England were not even on the same continent. They were separated by an ocean called Iapetus, a body of water that is now completely gone, consumed by its own geology, leaving behind no trace except in the rocks on either side of it. The landmass that would become Scotland was attached to what is now North America. The landmass that would become England and Wales was attached to what is now continental Europe. Between them lay a deep ocean, and then, over tens of millions of years, that ocean began to close. The two continental plates moved toward each other with the slow inevitability of all tectonic motion, a few centimeters a year, inexorable, and when they finally collided, the result was a mountain range. The Caledonian orogeny, as geologists call it, was one of the great mountain-building events of Earth history. It happened in several phases between roughly 450 and 390 million years ago, and at its height, it produced a continuous mountain chain that ran from what is now Norway through Scotland and Ireland and down through what is now the eastern coast of North America. The mountains of Scandinavia today and the Appalachian Mountains of America are the other surviving remnants of the same range. They are the same mountains, separated by the Atlantic Ocean, that opened up between them hundreds of millions of years later. At the height of the Caledonian Mountains, the peaks of what would become Scotland rose to heights comparable to the modern Himalayas. We are talking about mountains of 7, 8, 9,000 meters. Mountains with permanent glaciers and snowfields on their upper slopes. Mountains that would have produced their own weather systems, their own wind patterns, their own rain shadows. The world that existed around these mountains was warm and largely free of the kind of life we would recognize. There were no trees. There was very little vegetation of any kind on land. Life existed mainly in the oceans. The air had different proportions of gases. The days were slightly shorter. The moon was closer. Everything you see when you look at the Scottish Highlands today, the rounded profiles, the smoothed ridges, the broad glens, the deep lochs, is the product of what happened to those enormous mountains over the following 400 million years. They were eroded, continuously, relentlessly, by rain and frost and wind and rivers, and eventually, most dramatically, by ice. By the time the first human beings arrived in Britain after the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, the Caledonian Mountains had already been ground down to a fraction of their original height. Ben Nevis, the highest point in the British Isles today, stands at 1,345 meters. That is what is left. To put that in perspective, imagine if you had a building 500 meters tall and you let it stand through every kind of weather for 400 million years, and at the end of that process what remained was a doorstep. That is roughly the relationship between the original Caledonian Mountains and the Scottish Highlands you can walk today. What you are walking on is the doorstep. The building is gone so completely that it has been transported by rivers to the sea, dissolved in rainwater, blown away as dust, transformed into new rocks by heat and pressure, and eventually recycled back into the crust of the earth. But the Caledonian orogeny is only the first layer of this story. Britain has been involved in other mountain-building events since then. The Variscan orogeny, which happened between roughly 380 and 280 million years ago, when another set of continental collisions built another range to the south, produced the underlying geology of much of Wales, Devon, and Cornwall. Later still, much more recently in geological terms, the alpine orogeny that built the Alps also sent stress waves northward through Europe and helped tilt and crack and rearrange the rocks of Britain in ways that created the structural basins and uplifts we see today. The Lake District, that compact and extraordinarily beautiful concentration of fells and lakes in Cumbria, sits on a dome of ancient volcanic and intrusive igneous rock that was pushed up by these later tectonic stresses and then shaped by the last great agent of landscape formation, the ice. Because for much of the last 2.5 million years, during the period geologists call the Pleistocene, Britain has been repeatedly covered by enormous ice sheets. The most recent of these, which began retreating around 20,000 years ago and was largely gone from Britain by 12,000 years ago, shaped almost everything you see in upland Britain. Ice does not just smooth things. It carves, it plucks, it quarries into the rock with a force and precision that water alone cannot achieve. The characteristic shapes of the upland British landscape, the corries with their dark, cliff-backed lakes, the U-shaped glacial valleys with their flat floors and steep sides, the hanging valleys, where tributary streams now fall as waterfalls into the main valleys below, the long ribbon lakes like Windermere and Loch Ness and Loch Lomond, the roches moutonnées with their smooth upstream faces and plucked downstream faces, the drumlins and moraines and erratics, all of this is the work of ice. The last ice sheets did not just occupy the landscape, they designed it. When the ice finally retreated, it left behind a raw landscape of bare rock and glacial sediment, a landscape that was, in the most literal possible sense, clean. Whatever had been there before the ice arrived had been scraped away or buried. What the ice left behind was a blank canvas, and nature began immediately to paint on it. The first plants to colonize the bare ground after the ice were the pioneers, the tough and tolerant mosses and sedges and Arctic alpine herbs that could survive in thin, unstable soils on a still cold landscape. Then, as temperatures rose and soils began to develop, the trees came back. And this is where the story begins to converge with the human story, because what grew back across the British uplands after the ice was not heather and bracken, it was forest. The forest that covered Britain after the last ice age is known to ecologists as the wildwood. It was not a uniform blanket of one type of tree. It was a complex, dynamic, regionally varied mosaic of different tree species and woodland types, each adapted to local conditions of soil and altitude and aspect and rainfall. In the lowlands, particularly in southern and central England, the dominant trees were oak and lime, with hazel and holly and ash and field maple. In the wetter west and the uplands of Wales, oak was dominant, with birch and rowan and hazel. In Scotland, particularly in the north and west, the forests were dominated by Scots, pine and birch, with oak in the more sheltered valleys. This forest was not the tidy, spaced-out woodland of a landscaped park. It was dense and ancient and structurally complex in ways that modern plantation forests are not. There were ancient trees with massive gnarled trunks. There were fallen trees in various stages of decay, covered in mosses and ferns and fungi. There were areas of open ground created by windblow or the activities of large animals, quickly colonized by bramble and willow herb and rose before the trees returned. There were bogs and marshes and areas of wet woodland. The whole thing was alive with a diversity of species that we can barely imagine today, because almost nothing like it survives anywhere in Britain. The mammals that lived in this wildwood included animals that most British people would be astonished to know ever lived here. Brown bears, wolves, lynx, wild boar, beaver, aurochs, the wild ancestor of domestic cattle, enormous animals standing over 2 meters at the shoulder with horns that spread to more than a meter across. Elk, wild horses. These were not exotic visitors. They were part of the native British fauna, shaped over millions of years of evolution to live in and with this landscape. Their presence shaped the vegetation. The grazing of aurochs and elk, the rooting of wild boar, the damming activities of beavers, all created the structural heterogeneity that allowed the wildwood to support such extraordinary diversity. The pollen record tells us when this wildwood was at its most extensive. Around 8,000 years ago, at what ecologists call the Atlantic period, when the climate of Britain was slightly warmer and wetter than today, forest covered somewhere between 80 and 90% of the land surface of Britain. It reached in most places to an altitude of around 600 meters, and in the most sheltered upland valleys even higher. The uplands that we think of today as characteristic open moorland were, 8,000 years ago, either forested or at most lightly treed, with a ground flora of woodland grasses and ferns and shade-tolerant herbs, rather than the heather and bracken that dominate today. 8,000 years ago is not very long in geological time. It is not even very long in evolutionary time. But in terms of the development of the British landscape as we know it, it is practically the beginning of history, because that is approximately when the process that would transform the British uplands began. That is when the first significant human modification of the British landscape can be detected in the pollen record. That is when people started cutting down the trees. The Mesolithic people who lived in Britain after the Ice Age were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers, moving through the landscape in small groups, following the seasonal availability of food. For most of the Mesolithic period, lasting from roughly 12,000 to around 6,000 years ago, these people lived in and with the forest, rather than against it. Their impact on the landscape was real, but limited. They used fire to manage sections of forest, creating clearings that would have been more productive for game, and they certainly hunted many of the large mammals of the wildwood. The extinction of the giant elk in Britain, for example, likely involved human hunting pressure, though climate change also played a role. But the scale of Mesolithic modification was nothing compared to what came after. Around 6,000 years ago, farming arrived in Britain, carried by people who crossed from continental Europe and brought with them a completely different relationship to the land. Farmers needed cleared ground. They needed fields, not forest. And so they began to cut. The Neolithic clearances, as archaeologists call them, were the first great wave of systematic deforestation in British history. Over the period from roughly 6,000 to 4,000 years ago, Neolithic farmers cleared large areas of lowland forest across Britain to create fields for crops and pastures for livestock. In many areas, particularly in the lighter, more easily cultivated soils of the chalk downs and the limestone uplands, the clearances were so thorough that the forest never came back. The thin soils on chalk and limestone could not survive the loss of the tree cover that had created them over thousands of years. Once cleared and grazed, they became open grassland, and open grassland they have remained. In the uplands, the Neolithic clearances were followed by something that would permanently alter the character of the British mountains. When the trees were removed from upland slopes, several things happened. The soils, deprived of the organic matter contributed by leaf fall and the deep root systems of trees, began to lose their structure. Rainfall, which had previously been intercepted by leaf canopies and absorbed by complex root systems, began to run off the surface more quickly, carrying soil with it. In the wet upland climate of much of Britain, the increased wetness of the soil surface, combined with the removal of the trees that had previously kept it relatively dry through transpiration, led to the development of peat. Peat formation is one of the most significant and underappreciated processes in British landscape history. Peat forms when organic material, primarily dead plant matter, accumulates in waterlogged conditions faster than it can decompose. In the wet upland climates of Britain, particularly in Scotland, Wales, the Pennines, and the moorlands of Devon and Cornwall, the combination of high rainfall, low temperatures, and the human disruption of the tree cover created ideal conditions for peat formation. It's over thousands of years, the peat built up, metre by metre, until in some upland areas it reached depths of several meters. Peat is both a record and a cage. It is a record because within it, preserved by the acid and anaerobic conditions, are the pollen grains of every plant that has grown in the area since the peat started forming. Core samples through upland peat bogs are essentially time capsules, recording changes in the local vegetation in extraordinary detail. When palynologists, the scientists who study fossil pollen, analyze these cores, they can tell you when the trees disappeared, what replaced them, when human activity began, when it intensified, when specific crops were introduced, when particular species went locally extinct. The peat records everything. And it is a cage, because once peat has formed, it makes the re-establishment of trees on those upland slopes extremely difficult. The waterlogged, acid conditions of deep peat are hostile to tree seedlings. Even in the absence of grazing pressure, many upland peat bogs would struggle to regenerate tree cover spontaneously. The human action that created the conditions for peat formation set in motion a process that then locked the landscape into its deforested state for thousands of years. This is one of the most important and least understood facts about the upland British landscape. The bare moorland of the Pennines, of Dartmoor, of the Scottish peatlands, is not a natural landscape in any meaningful sense. It is an artifact. It is the product of human decisions made 4, 5, 6,000 years ago, decisions whose ecological consequences have compounded and amplified over millennia until the landscape we see today bears almost no resemblance to what was there before. But the Neolithic clearances were only the beginning. Each subsequent phase of British prehistory and history brought new waves of forest clearance, each driven by different economic and social pressures, each adding its own layer of destruction to the cumulative total. The Bronze Age saw the expansion of upland farming onto land that had previously been considered too marginal, driven by a period of slightly warmer and drier climate that briefly made upland cultivation viable. When the climate cooled again, around 3,000 years ago, the soils on these cleared upland slopes were too degraded to support the communities that had farmed them, and those communities retreated, leaving behind the field systems and hut circles that archaeologists still find on upland moors, preserved under the peat that subsequently covered them. The Iron Age brought with it a technology, iron tools, that made tree felling significantly easier than it had been with stone or bronze implements. Iron axes could cut through large trees far more efficiently than anything that had gone before. The Iron Age also brought increased population pressure and an agricultural system that required substantial areas of cleared land to support the densities of people that were beginning to accumulate around the defended hill forts that are one of the characteristic signatures of this period in the British landscape. Then the Romans arrived, and with them came demands on the British landscape of a new and very different kind. The Roman military and administrative apparatus required enormous quantities of timber for construction, for heating, for smelting, for shipbuilding. The great lead mining operations that the Romans established in the Mendips, in North Wales, and in other parts of Britain required charcoal as fuel for smelting, which required the systematic coppicing and clearance of woodland over wide areas. Roman agriculture was more intensive than what had come before and required more cleared land. The Roman road network required clearing and, in some cases, significant earth moving. It would be wrong to blame the Romans for the destruction of the British wildwood. Most of that destruction had already happened by the time the Romans arrived. But the Roman period added its own increment to the total, and it set economic patterns, particularly the industrial use of woodland resources, that would intensify rather than diminish after the Romans left. The medieval period, from the Norman conquest in the 11th century to the beginning of the early modern period in the 16th, is the period in which the management of what remained of the British woodland was systematized and intensified in ways that, paradoxically, both protected and exploited it. The Normans introduced a system of royal forests across large areas of England, areas that were reserved by law for royal hunting and where the clearance and cultivation of land was tightly controlled. This was not conservation in any modern sense. It was the protection of a royal resource, the deer and other game that the forests contained, and it was maintained through a legal apparatus of brutal punishments for poaching and encroachment. But incidentally, the royal forest system did preserve substantial areas of woodland that might otherwise have been cleared for agriculture. The New Forest in Hampshire, the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire, Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire, Epping Forest in Essex, all of these survive as areas of woodland today, in large part because they were royal forests in the medieval period and therefore protected, however imperfectly, from the clearance that consumed the unprotected woodland around them. Outside the royal forests, the medieval period saw the continuation and acceleration of woodland clearance across Britain. The monastic houses that proliferated after the Norman conquest were major agents of agricultural improvement, and improvement in the medieval context meant clearance. The great Cistercian monasteries of Yorkshire and the north, Revolks, Fountains, Byland, Jervolks, controlled enormous areas of upland land and managed them primarily as sheepwalks. Sheep were the economic engine of medieval Britain in a way that is difficult to overstate. Wool was the primary export commodity. The great churches and abbeys of England were built on the proceeds of wool sales, and sheep, as any farmer or ecologist will tell you, the one coexist easily with tree regeneration. A sheep will eat almost any tree seedling that dares to emerge from the ground. The combination of teeth and tongue, and the close-cropping nibble of a sheep's mouth, is perfectly designed to prevent a seedling from establishing itself before it has a chance to grow beyond the grazable zone. Where sheep are maintained at significant densities on land that once carried forest, that land will remain treeless indefinitely, not because trees cannot germinate, but because every seedling that germinates is immediately consumed. The upland sheepwalks of the medieval monasteries did not just exploit the cleared land, they prevented the land from recovering. This is a pattern that would repeat and intensify over the following centuries. The sheep economy of upland Britain, particularly in Wales and Scotland, combined with the economic and social pressures that would culminate in the highland clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries, would progressively strip whatever remained of the upland woodland and replace it with a landscape managed exclusively for grazing. But before we get to the clearances, we need to talk about the Tudor period and what it did to the remaining woodlands of Britain. The 16th century saw a combination of population growth, increased industrial activity, and above all the demands of naval shipbuilding that put enormous pressure on the timber resources of the country. The Tudor Navy, which under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I became a significant instrument of English power, required vast quantities of oak for its warships. A single large warship might contain timber from 4,000 oak trees. The demands of naval shipbuilding, combined with the requirements of house construction, charcoal production for iron smelting, and the general timber needs of an expanding economy, consumed the remaining old-growth woodlands of Britain at a rate that alarmed contemporaries. John Evelyn, writing in 1664, was sounding an alarm that many people before him had also sounded, though without his eloquence. His book, Silver, one of the most influential works of environmental writing in British history, was a direct response to the concern of the Royal Society that Britain was running out of timber for the Navy. Evelyn argued passionately for the planting of new trees and the proper management of existing woodlands, and his arguments were not abstract or philosophical. They were driven by a very concrete recognition that the destruction of the British woodland had reached a point where it was threatening the strategic capabilities of the state. Evelyn's concern was justified. By the mid-17th century, the woodland cover of England had fallen to somewhere around 10% of the land surface, a figure that represented a catastrophic decline from the 80 or 90% of 8,000 years earlier. Scotland still retained more, partly because its more rugged terrain had made some areas inaccessible to the axes of the medieval and early modern periods, but the direction of travel was unmistakable. The 18th century brought two developments that would each, in their own way, complete the destruction of what little remained of the upland woodland heritage of Britain. The first was the agricultural revolution and the enclosure movement, which transformed the management of the British countryside on a scale and at a speed without precedent. The enclosure of common land, the consolidation of scattered strip fields into larger holdings, the draining of wetlands, and the improvement of pasture, all of this reshaped the lowland landscape with extraordinary thoroughness. Hedgerow trees and copses survived in the lowlands, but the landscape was transformed from a complex mosaic of uses and habitats into a more rationalized, more legible, more economically efficient agricultural system. But it was in the uplands that the 18th century inflicted its most lasting damage. The highland clearances, which began in earnest in the second half of the 18th century and continued through the first half of the 19th, were one of the great forced demographic transformations of modern British history. The landlords of the Scottish Highlands, many of them anglicised and educated, convinced of the economic rationality of commercial sheep farming and contemptuous of the traditional crofting communities that had occupied their estates for generations, evicted hundreds of thousands of people from the land their families had farmed for centuries and replaced them with sheep. The clearances were brutal in their human consequences. Families were forcibly removed from homes that had stood for generations, their houses sometimes burned to prevent their return, the occupants left to find passage to the industrial cities of the south, or to emigrate to Canada, Australia, New Zealand. The demographic consequences for the Scottish Highlands were devastating and permanent. Communities that had supported thousands of people were replaced by the silence of empty moorland. The names of the cleared townships are still there on old maps. Names in Gaelic, beautiful and melancholy, marking places where nothing now remains but a few grass-grown ridges in the heather where the lazy beds were. But for our purposes, the ecological consequences of the clearances are as significant as the human ones. The traditional crofting communities of the Highlands had a complex relationship with the land that, while certainly not environmentally benign, was at least diverse. Crofters kept cattle as well as sheep, and cattle management is different from sheep management in ways that matter for vegetation. Cattle tend to graze more selectively, leaving rough vegetation that can provide cover for tree regeneration. They also tend to concentrate in lower, wetter areas rather than ranging onto the highest and most exposed ground. Crofters also relied on woodland for fuel and building materials and had some incentive to maintain at least minimal woodland cover on their lands. The commercial sheep farming that replaced the crofting communities had none of these constraints. Blackface and Cheviot sheep were managed at high densities across the full range of the upland landscape, from valley bottom to ridge top. Their grazing pressure was continuous and intense, and it targeted precisely the young tree and shrub growth that would otherwise have allowed woodland to regenerate on the cleared upland slopes. The Caledonian forest, the ancient pine woods of the Scottish Highlands that had once covered millions of acres, was reduced to a few scattered fragments in protected glens. The birch woods that had clothed the lower slopes were grazed to nothing. The alder and willow that had lined the burns were stripped back to isolated survivors. The result was the landscape that most people today, including most Scots, simply accept as normal. The bare brown moorland sweeping up to the rocky ridges, the treeless glens, the mountains rising from a ground flora of heather and deergrass and cotton grass. Beautiful, certainly. Atmospheric, unquestionably. But not natural. Not wild. Not what it was. Not what it should be. And then on top of the sheep came the grouse. The Victorian and Edwardian fascination with driven grouse shooting transformed the management of large areas of upland Britain, particularly in England and Scotland, in ways that created another kind of artificial landscape. Red grouse need heather to thrive. They eat heather shoots and nest in heather. To maximize grouse populations, moorland managers burn heather in a regular rotation, creating a patchwork of heather at different stages of growth, the young, fresh growth providing food, and the older, taller growth providing cover. This burning regime, called swaling or muirburn, maintains the heather moorland in a state that is ideal for grouse and almost ideal for nothing else. The management of grouse moors also involved, and in many places continues to involve, the systematic persecution of predators. Anything that might prey on grouse, their eggs, or their chicks was killed. Foxes, stoats, weasels, crows, ravens, hares, and crucially, birds of prey were trapped, shot, and poisoned on an enormous scale. The hen harrier, a beautiful and legally protected bird of prey that nests on the ground in heather moorland, should be abundant in the British uplands. It is almost absent from grouse moors in England and Scotland, despite being theoretically protected by law, because of the ongarahoo and largely unprosecuted killing by gamekeepers. The landscape of the grouse moor is a landscape managed for a single species of game bird at the expense of almost everything else. The 20th century added one more dimension to this story of upland degradation, and it came from an unexpected direction. The Forestry Commission, established by Act of Parliament in 1919 inches, response to the timber shortages of the First World War, set about the task of creating a strategic timber reserve for Britain with a thoroughness and a disregard for ecological values that now looks, in retrospect, like a second environmental catastrophe layered on top of the first. The Commission's solution to the problem of Britain's timber shortage was to plant large areas of upland Britain with fast-growing conifers, primarily Sitka spruce from North America and to a lesser extent Norway spruce and various pine species. These plantations were laid out in rectangular blocks across hillsides, planted in straight rows, managed for timber production rather than biodiversity, and harvested in clear fell cycles that left the landscape looking, in the short term, like a battlefield. They covered hundreds of thousands of acres of upland Britain, including some of the few remaining fragments of native woodland and some of the most important upland peat bogs in Europe. The flow country of Caithness and Sutherland, the largest expanse of blanket peat bog in Europe, one of the most important carbon stores and biodiversity habitats in the whole of Britain, there was targeted for afforestation in the 1970s and 1980s. The combination of deep ploughing to improve drainage for the conifers, which destroyed the peat structure and released vast quantities of stored carbon, and the shading out of the bog vegetation by the growing trees, represented an ecological disaster on a European scale. It was only halted by a combination of scientific pressure and the withdrawal of the tax incentives that had made it economically attractive. The irony of the Forestry Commission's work is profound. Britain had been stripped of its native woodland over 6,000 years, and the response to this historical woodland loss was to cover the landscape with dense monocultures of alien conifers that supported barely any more native biodiversity than the open moorland they replaced, and in some respects supported less. The Sitka spruce plantation is not a forest in any ecologically meaningful sense. It is a crop, a very large crop, managed on a long rotation, but a crop nonetheless. The floor of a Sitka plantation in its middle years is almost devoid of light, and therefore almost devoid of life. The dense, acid needle litter suppresses ground flora. The closed canopy prevents shrub and small tree growth. The regimented spacing and single-species composition provides minimal structural diversity for wildlife. So by the end of the 20th century, the upland British landscape was in a condition that can only be described as one of the most severely ecologically degraded in the developed world. Britain had less than 13% woodland cover, one of the lowest figures in Europe, compared to 33% in Germany, 31% in France, 44% in Finland, 59% in Sweden. The woodland that did exist was heavily fragmented, much of it composed of non-native species, and a substantial proportion of what was classified as woodland was in fact plantation forestry with minimal biodiversity value. The upland landscapes, the mountains and moors that so many people find beautiful and call wild, were maintained in their treeless state by two principal forces: overgrazing by sheep and deer, and the active management of grouse moors, the native woodland fragments that survived, the patches of Caledonian pinewood in the Scottish Highlands, the sessile oak woods on Welsh hillsides, the Atlantic hazel scrub of the western coasts, represented a few percent of their former extent and were actively threatened by browsing pressure that prevented regeneration. Yet something strange happened as the 20th century gave way to the 21st. Something that might, if its current trajectory continues, eventually begin to address the damage of those 6,000 years. The rewilding movement began to gain traction in Britain, and with it came a new way of thinking about the upland landscape that started to challenge the aesthetic and cultural assumptions that had prevented people from seeing what these landscapes actually were. Rewilding, in the British context, is not a simple or universally agreed concept. At its most ambitious, it involves the reintroduction of large predators and herbivores, including species like lynx and wolves that have been absent from Britain for hundreds or thousands of years, combined with the removal or significant reduction of grazing pressure to allow vegetation, including woodland, to return to upland landscapes. At its more modest end, it involves fencing off areas of moorland from deer and sheep to allow natural regeneration and the restoration of native woodland species and peatland habitats. The results of even the most modest rewilding experiments in Britain have been dramatic and, to many people, deeply moving. At the Allerdale Wilderness Reserve in Sutherland, at Trees for Life's Dundregan Estate in the Great Glen, at the rewilding projects on the Mar Lodge Estate in the Cairngorms, on Exmoor, in parts of Wales and the Lake District, areas that were previously bare moorland have been seen to respond to the removal of grazing pressure with an extraordinary speed and exuberance of regeneration. Trees come back. Birch and rowan and willow, the pioneer species of the British uplands, seed in almost immediately. Within a few years, shrubs are established. Within a decade, young woodland is present. The speed of recovery, when given the chance, is both encouraging and faintly heartbreaking, because it demonstrates so clearly that the capacity for restoration was always there, suppressed but not destroyed, waiting only for the pressure to be lifted. Perhaps the most striking demonstration of what the upland British landscape could look like without continuous grazing pressure is not the result of any deliberate rewilding project. It is something you can observe for yourself in any part of Britain where steep cliffs, rocky outcrops, or simple inaccessibility have prevented sheep and deer from reaching. On the sea cliffs of Pembrokeshire, on the rocky faces of some Scottish mountains, in the gorges and ravines where the terrain is too broken for grazing animals to navigate, you find trees, not the alien conifers of the forestry plantation, but native trees. Sessile oak and ash, rowan and holly, hazel and birch, growing in conditions that look exactly like the conditions that prevail on the adjacent accessible slopes, except that these slopes are cloaked in woodland, while the others are bare. These cliff face fragments, these gorge woodlands, these inaccessible patches of surviving native vegetation are what ecologists call refugia. They are the places where the original vegetation has survived, not because anyone protected it, but because the geography protected it. They are glimpses into the past, windows onto what the whole upland landscape looked like before the sheep and the fire and the axe. Stand at the edge of one of these gorge woodlands in mid-Wales or in the Western Highlands and look out over the bare moorland stretching to the horizon, and then look back at the trees around you, and you will understand in your body, not just in your intellect, the scale of what has been lost. The pollen record that lies buried in the peat of Britain's upland bogs tells this same story in scientific rather than aesthetic terms. Pollen is almost indestructible. The outer coat of a pollen grain, made of a material called sporopollenin, can survive in the right conditions for hundreds of millions of years. Peat is one of the ideal environments for this preservation. And so when palynologists core upland peat bogs and extract the pollen layers, they find a detailed record of the vegetation history of the surrounding landscape, going back in some cases 6, 7, 8,000 years. Those cores tell a consistent story. They show abundant tree pollen, oak and birch and hazel and pine, dominating the record through the Mesolithic and into the Neolithic. Then, at different points in different places, but broadly between 6 and 4,000 years ago, the tree pollen declines. It does not vanish all at once, but it falls steadily, replaced by the pollen of grasses and cereals and the characteristic weed species of disturbed ground, plantain, and dock and nettle. These are the agricultural indicator species, the weeds that move in when ground is broken for cultivation or heavily grazed. Their appearance in the pollen record marks the arrival of farming in each particular location with the precision of a signature. Later, layers in the same cause often show a temporary recovery of tree pollen, corresponding to periods when populations declined or farming was temporarily abandoned. The Black Death in the 14th century, which killed between a third and a half of the population of Britain, shows up in some upland pollen records as a brief resurgence of woodland, a few decades when the grazing pressure lifted and the trees began to come back, before the recovery of human population density pushed them back again. And then, in the most recent layers, the picture is bleak and consistent. Tree pollen continues to decline, or is replaced by the pollen of non-native conifers. The diversity of the pollen assemblage decreases. The landscape, as recorded in the pollen archive, becomes simpler, more uniform, more dominated by the single species of grass that grows on heavily grazed moorland. This archive, this record written in pollen grains no larger than specks of dust, is one of the most powerful arguments against the idea that the current state of the British uplands is natural. It is one of the reasons why the claim that these bare hills and moors are wilderness is not just aesthetically mistaken but scientifically wrong. The pollen tells you what was here before. And what was here before was forest. But knowing that something was different does not by itself tell you what to do about it. The question of how to respond to the ecological history of the British uplands is not straightforwardly a scientific question. It is also a cultural question, an economic question, a political question. And it is these dimensions of the story that make the argument about the British uplands so charged and so unresolved. The people who farm the British uplands, particularly the hill farmers of Wales and Scotland and northern England, have a profound and legitimate attachment to these landscapes. For many hill farming families, the management of sheep on open moorland has been a way of life for generations. The landscape they have made, even if it bears no resemblance to what was there before the first axes fell, is their landscape. Their identity is bound up with it. Their skills are adapted to it. Their understanding of weather and terrain and animal behavior, built up over generations, is specifically tuned to the conditions of the open moorland farm. The economic basis of this farming is precarious. Hill farming in Britain has been kept alive for decades, primarily by the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, which paid subsidies per head of livestock. This created a direct incentive to maintain or increase flock sizes, which in turn maintained or increased the grazing pressure that kept the landscape treeless. The post-Brexit transition to a new agricultural subsidy system, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which aims to pay farmers for delivering public goods such as biodiversity and carbon sequestration rather than simply for producing food, represents a significant shift in the economic logic of upland farming. But the transition is complex and contested, and the outcomes uncertain. There is also a deep cultural and aesthetic resistance to the idea of allowing the upland landscape to tree up. The openness of the British uplands is genuinely loved by many people, not just farmers. Walkers, climbers, photographers, artists, writers have all shaped their relationship to the British landscape in response to its openness, its sense of space and sky, its quality of light across bare hillside. The idea of those landscapes disappearing under woodland cover is aesthetically troubling to people for whom the open moorland is the archetype of what the word landscape means. This resistance is understandable, but it rests, in part, on a misunderstanding. When ecologists or rewilders talk about allowing tree cover to return to the British uplands, they are not typically proposing the replacement of every square metre of open ground with dense plantation. They are proposing a mosaic, a landscape that contains woodland and open ground and wetland and heath in a complex mix, more like the landscape that existed before the clearances than either the bare moorland of today or the dense conifer plantation that was the 20th century's mistaken response to woodland loss. A rewilded upland landscape would still have mountains. Ben Nevis would still be there. Snowdon would still be there. The Brecon beacons would still rise from their valleys. But the lower slopes, currently bare moorland or overused sheep pasture, would carry woodland again. The burns and rivers would be lined with trees. The lochs would have reed beds and aldercar along their margins. The peat bogs of the high ground would be restored and actively sequestering carbon. The landscape would be more diverse, more structurally complex, more biologically productive, and more resilient to the climate changes that are already beginning to alter the ecology of the British uplands in ways that are not yet fully understood. The wolf, the lynx, the brown bear, the aurochs, these are more complicated propositions. Their reintroduction is not imminent, and the debate around it is heated. What is not complicated, and what is already happening in several places, is the reintroduction of the beaver. Beavers were hunted to extinction in Britain by the 16th century, their pelts valued for the international fur trade, their meat and musk, castoreum, prized for medicinal use. They have now been reintroduced, initially illegally by enthusiasts in Scotland who released beavers on the River Tay and then successfully lobbied for their legal status to be recognised, and subsequently through a series of licensed reintroductions in England, most notably on the River Otter in Devon, and in several enclosed sites in other parts of Britain. The ecological impact of beavers on British rivers has been more significant and more positive than even the optimists predicted. Beavers create dams that slow the flow of water through upland valleys. These dams create ponds behind them that flood valley-bottom land, creating wetland habitat of extraordinary richness. The slowing of water flow reduces the speed and severity of flood events downstream. The impounded water raises the local water table, which benefits the surrounding vegetation and creates moisture conditions that allow a much wider range of plants and animals to thrive. The structure of the dammed streams, with their alternation of still pools and faster riffles, is ideal for fish, particularly trout and salmon. Within a few years of beaver reintroduction, the surrounding landscape is transformed. This is what ecosystems do when their component parts are allowed to function together. They self-organize toward complexity and productivity in ways that no amount of management intervention can replicate. The beaver does not know that it is restoring the landscape. It is simply doing what beavers have always done, what beavers were doing in Britain for tens of thousands of years before they were killed. But the effects of that activity ripple outward through the ecosystem in ways that benefit species the beaver has never encountered, and processes the beaver is wholly unaware of. The return of the beaver is a small but genuine beginning of something larger. It is evidence that the ecological memory of a landscape, the capacity for recovery encoded in the surviving fragments of native species and the dormant seed bank in upland soils, is more resilient than the degraded condition of that landscape might suggest. When you walk over a bare Welsh hillside and look at the impoverished, close-grazed grassland stretching from horizon to horizon, it is easy to conclude that nothing of the original ecosystem remains. But buried in the soil beneath your feet are seeds of native trees and shrubs, dormant but viable, waiting for conditions that will allow them to germinate. Fragments of native vegetation survive in the cliff faces and rocky outcrops and along watercourses. The soil microorganisms that would support woodland remain, suppressed but not destroyed. The question that haunts anyone who thinks seriously about the ecological history of the British uplands is a simple one. What do we owe this landscape? Not in a legal or regulatory sense, but in a deeper sense. If these hills and mountains were something different before human action made them what they are, do we have an obligation to restore them? Or has enough time passed, and enough human life and culture been shaped by the landscape as it is, that we should accept the current condition and work within it? There is no single answer to this question. It will be worked out differently in different places, by different communities, under different economic and political pressures. In some parts of Scotland, the evidence of change is already accumulating rapidly. The Cairngorms, Britain's largest national park, is seeing significant woodland regeneration on hillsides from which sheep have been removed. Trees for Life, the Highland Rewilding charity founded by Alan Watson Featherstone, has planted millions of native trees in the Caledonian Forest region. Several large estates have converted from grouse shooting to rewilding projects, with results that are generating both enthusiasm among conservationists and, inevitably, controversy among those who see the grouse moor economy as culturally and economically vital. In Wales, the Cambrian Wildwood Project and smaller initiatives are trying to recreate native upland woodland on degraded hillsides. In England, projects in the Lake District, on Dartmoor, in the North Pennines and the Yorkshire Dales, are exploring different models of upland land management that involve reducing livestock numbers and allowing natural processes to work. None of these projects is uncontested. All of them involve difficult conversations with farming communities, landowners, local authorities, and members of the public who have strong and often conflicting views about what the upland landscape is for and what it should look like. But what all of these projects share, and what makes them different in kind from the conservation approaches that preceded them, is a recognition that the current state of the British uplands is not a baseline. It is not the starting point from which we should measure change. It is itself a highly modified, historically contingent, culturally produced condition that was arrived at through a long process of destruction. To accept it as normal, to manage for its continuation, is not neutrality. It is a choice to maintain the consequences of 6,000 years of ecological damage. The mountains of Britain are not mountains in the way that the Himalayas or the Alps are mountains. They are the eroded stumps of vanished ranges, ground down over hundreds of millions of years to a fraction of their original height. But even those stumps, those ancient weathered rocks, were not bare in the way they are bare now. They were forested, from valley bottom to the tree line, at 500 or 600 meters altitude, in a complex, species-rich, ecologically dynamic woodland that no longer exists in any but the most fragmentary form. To walk in the British uplands with this knowledge is to walk through a landscape that is simultaneously beautiful and tragic. Beautiful in the way that ruins can be beautiful, in the way that a landscape in the aftermath of something can have its own kind of austere grandeur. Tragic because the complexity and richness that was here, the symphony of species and processes that filled these hills for 8,000 years before human agriculture began, is so thoroughly gone that most people have no idea it ever existed. The heather and the bracken and the bare rock have become the landscape in the cultural imagination. They are what people mean when they say they love the British countryside. They do not know what they have lost because they never knew what was there. The archaeologist Neil Oliver, walking across the Highlands in a television documentary some years ago, described the upland Scottish landscape as wild and primeval. He is not unique in this. The vocabulary of wilderness and primeval landscape is applied routinely to the British uplands by journalists, travel writers, television presenters, and tourists. It is a vocabulary that tells you more about the limitations of cultural memory than about the actual history of the places being described. The upland British landscape is no more primeval than a car park. Less so in some respects, because a car park at least reflects the actual values and priorities of the people who made it, rather than the accumulated unintended consequences of 6,000 years of agricultural and pastoral decisions. What would it mean to have an honest relationship with this landscape? What would it mean to see the bare hillside not as wilderness but as wound, not as primeval but as profoundly, irreversibly historical, not as the given condition of the British land but as the product of specific human choices, most of them made under economic pressures that no longer apply, by people who had no understanding of the ecological consequences of their actions? It would mean, first of all, changing the language, stopping the use of words like wild and pristine and ancient to describe landscapes that are in ecological terms young and profoundly modified. Not because this language is dishonest in the sense of being deliberately misleading, but because it prevents us from thinking clearly about what these places are and what they could be. Language shapes perception. If the bare moorland is always already wild, then there is nothing to restore. If it is understood as damaged, then the question of repair becomes possible to ask. It would mean, second, taking seriously the scale of what has been lost, not in a spirit of guilt or self-flagellation, but in a spirit of honest accounting. Britain has lost something of extraordinary value. The wildwood, the complex mosaic of native woodland that covered most of this country for thousands of years after the last ice age, was one of the great ecological systems of the temperate world. It has been reduced to fragments. Its constituent species survive, precariously, in isolated patches. Its associated fauna, the large mammals, the specialist birds, the invertebrates of old-growth woodland are severely depleted. The ecosystem services it provided, the regulation of water flow, the storage of carbon, the maintenance of soil structure, the filtering of nutrients, are largely absent from the upland landscape. It would mean, third, making different decisions about how these landscapes are managed and for whose benefit. The current subsidy framework, which is in the process of changing but has not yet changed in practice for most upland farmers, has for decades paid farmers to maintain grazing pressure that keeps the landscape treeless. A framework that pays for the delivery of public goods, including biodiversity, carbon storage, and flood management, would create different incentives and different outcomes. This is not a radical proposition. It is the explicit intention of the post-Brexit agricultural policy framework in England. Whether the intention will be delivered is a different question. It would mean, fourth, accepting that some things cannot be restored. The aurochs is gone. The giant deer is gone. The extensive old-growth wildwood of 8,000 years ago is gone in a way that cannot be replicated on any timescale relevant to human planning. Ecological restoration in the British uplands is not about recreating the past. It is about creating the conditions for native ecological processes to function more fully in the future than they currently do. It is about adding complexity, adding diversity, adding the structural and functional richness that comes from allowing woodland to grow and large animals to move through it and water to be held in the landscape rather than rushing off it. And it would mean, finally, reckoning with the human dimension of this story. The people who cleared the British uplands were not villains. They were farmers, responding to economic pressures, feeding their families, doing what made sense within the constraints of their time and knowledge. The crofters who were cleared from the highland glens were the victims of the process, not its agents. The hill farmers of today are the inheritors of a system that has shaped their landscape and their livelihoods and their identities over generations, and the decisions we make about that landscape will affect their lives and their communities in ways that need to be taken seriously. The ecological history of the British uplands is not a story with a simple moral. It is not a story of good people and bad people, of villains and heroes. It is a story of the slow accumulation of consequences, of actions taken for entirely understandable reasons over thousands of years that produced outcomes none of the actors intended or could have foreseen. It is a story about the relationship between human beings and the land they depend on, and about what happens when that relationship loses its connection to ecological reality. The mountains of Britain are not mountains. They are the worn-down roots of mountains that were once among the tallest on Earth. They were forested for longer than they have been bare. The forest that covered them was one of the great wild systems of the temperate world. It is gone, reduced to fragments by thousands of years of human action. What remains is beautiful in its way, but it is the beauty of aftermath. The beauty of what is left when something larger and more complex and more alive has been taken away. To know this is not to be unable to love the heather and the bracken and the bare ridgeline against the winter sky. It is to love them with full knowledge of what they represent. It is to love them as one loves a scar, understanding that the scar is also a history, that it marks the place where something happened, that the story it tells is more complicated and more important than the smooth skin of a surface that has never been broken. The deep history of the British landscape is not taught in schools. It is not part of the standard tourist experience of national parks and mountain trails. It is not included in most of the nature writing that has become such a significant genre in contemporary British literature, though some of the best of that writing touches on it. It lives in the peat records and the archaeological literature and the specialist journals of palynology and historical ecology, and in the work of a small number of writers and scientists who have tried to make it accessible to a wider audience, but it is also, in a way that is hard to articulate, but real, present in the landscape itself. The ancient twisted oaks in the gorge woodland above the Afon Rheidol in Wales, survivors of a forest that once clothed these hills from valley bottom to ridge, have a quality of presence that is qualitatively different from the young planted trees in the adjacent forestry block. The ancient Caledonian pines in the black wood of Rannoch, their trunks orange-red in the winter light, their roots gripping the thin soil of a drumlin above the frozen loch, are survivors of a forest that has been retreating for thousands of years. They are not individual trees, they are fragments of a system, living remnants of a world that is almost gone. To walk among them, to stand in the silence under their canopy and smell the resin and the peat, and the particular quality of air that a real forest creates, is to have a visceral, embodied encounter with deep history. It is to feel, without being able to fully articulate it, that you are standing in a place that is older and more complex than the landscape around it, that the bare moor beyond the wood's edge is the anomaly, not the wood, that the trees are what belongs here, and the emptiness beyond them is the wound. The mountains of Britain are waiting, the rocks are old enough, the capacity for recovery is there, dormant in the soil. The fragments of surviving native woodland are producing seeds, as they have always done, seeds that fall to the ground and germinate, and are immediately eaten by deer and sheep before they can establish. Remove the pressure. Allow the recovery. Give it time. Not our time, not a political cycle or a planning horizon, but real time. The time of forests, the time of accumulating complexity and returning abundance. Give it decades, give it centuries. In geological terms, it will be nothing. In the terms of the living world that inhabits these ancient rocks, it will be everything. Let us look more closely at the specific mountains of Britain and what their rocks and their histories actually tell us, because each of the major upland regions has its own chapter in this story, and the details matter. Ben Nevis, the highest point in the British Isles, is a mass of granite and metamorphic rock that was emplaced deep in the Earth's crust during the Caledonian orogeny, heated and compressed and transformed by the colossal pressures of continental collision. The rocks you touch on the summit plateau of Ben Nevis were formed at depths of perhaps 10 kilometers below the surface of the Earth. They have been brought to the surface entirely by erosion. Everything that was above them has been worn away. What you stand on at the summit is not the top of a mountain. It is the base of what was once a mountain, exposed after an almost incomprehensibly long period of denudation. The summit of Ben Nevis today receives an average of 450 millimeters of snow per year and is in cloud for more than 300 days out of 365. Even in summer, the plateau can be bitterly cold and winds can reach hurricane force. The vegetation on the summit is sparse and specialist, a community of mosses and liverworts and cushion-forming plants adapted to the most extreme conditions in the British Isles. Nothing about this summit environment suggests woodland, but come down just 200 or 300 meters onto the lower slopes of the mountain, and the story changes. Here, in the absence of the constant grazing pressure that defines most of the landscape, in the fenced nature reserves, and on the cliff faces that sheep cannot reach, you find trees, birch and rowan and willow, with hazel lower down. These are not garden escapes or planted trees. They are native species, seeding in naturally wherever the grazing pressure is reduced. The great glen that stretches from Fort William and Loch Linhay in the southwest to Inverness and the Moray Firth in the northeast, a straight geological fault line that cuts Britain's most northerly promontory nearly in two, was once forested along its entire length. The lochans and bogs and peat-covered hillsides that now characterize this extraordinary landscape were, 8,000 years ago, clothed in the complex mosaic of Caledonian pine, wood and birch and alder that palynologists can trace through the pollen record. The deer forests, as the bare deer-stalking moors of the highlands are still called with a magnificent irony, are forests only in name. They contain almost no trees. The deer themselves are part of the story. Red deer are native to Britain and were part of the original wildwood ecosystem. But in the wildwood, their numbers were regulated by wolves and other large predators, and they lived in an environment that was complex enough to absorb their impact without being overwhelmed by it. Today, in the absence of predators, and in some regions actively managed for sport shooting at artificially high densities, red deer in the Scottish Highlands number somewhere around 150,000 animals. The browsing pressure they exert on whatever woody vegetation attempts to regenerate is enormous. A red deer herd at highland densities will strip every tree seedling from a hillside as effectively as any flock of sheep. The problem of deer in the Scottish Highlands is in some ways a microcosm of the larger problem of the upland British landscape. The deer are not just a grazing animal gone too numerous. They are a cultural symbol, deeply embedded in the mythology of Highland Scotland, central to an estate economy that employs gamekeepers and stalkers and gillies and contributes significantly to local rural incomes. The red deer on the hillside is an icon of the Highland landscape, in the same way that the heather moorland is an icon. Both icons are the product of a specific historical and economic arrangement that has nothing to do with ecological function and everything to do with land ownership and the economics of sport. Land ownership in Scotland is among the most concentrated in the developed world. Roughly 430 private landowners own half of the private land in rural Scotland, an area of some 3 million hectares. Many of these estates are managed primarily for field sports, for red deer stalking and grouse shooting, activities that by their nature maintain the landscape in a treeless, species-poor condition. The reform of Scottish land ownership, through the Land Reform Act of 2003 and subsequent legislation, has given communities the right to buy land when it comes up for sale and has encouraged the transfer of some estate land to community ownership. But the fundamental concentration of ownership remains, and with it, the fundamental right of private landowners to manage their land as they see fit within the constraints of planning and environmental law. This is not simply a Scottish problem. In Wales, large areas of the uplands are owned by a small number of landowners, including in many cases the major water utility companies, which own catchment land above their reservoirs and manage it in ways that prioritize clean water supply rather than biodiversity. In the Lake District, the combination of the National Trust, which owns large areas of the Central Fells, and a farming community with deep cultural roots and strong legal protections through the Upland Commons system has made significant ecological change extremely difficult to achieve. The Lake District is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, designated in part because of its cultural landscape, its fells grazed by Herdwick sheep in a pattern that has persisted for centuries. The designation recognizes and effectively freezes a landscape that is, from an ecological standpoint, severely degraded. This is the deepest tension in the British upland landscape debate. On one side, the recognition that the current ecological condition of these landscapes is the product of centuries of damage, and that significant restoration is possible and desirable. On the other side, the recognition that the landscapes as they currently exist have generated their own cultural value, their own beauty as understood by the people who live in and with them, their own economic functions, however marginal and subsidy-dependent, and their own claim on the attachment of communities whose identity is built around them. There is no simple resolution of this tension. But it is worth noting that the cultural attachment to the treeless upland landscape is itself historically recent, in the context of the longer story. The Romantic movement's aestheticization of wild and open landscape, which gave us the Lake District as a cultural destination and the Scottish Highlands as a sublime wilderness, is a product of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Before that, the prevailing aesthetic was one that valued cultivation and improvement and productivity. The bare moor was not beautiful. It was waste, literally waste land that was not producing what land was supposed to produce. The wild Highlander in the treeless glen was not a figure of romance, but of poverty and backwardness. The Romantic movement changed all this. Painters like J.M.W. Turner and later the members of the Victorian art establishment, and writers like Walter Scott and later John Keats and Alfred Lord Tennyson produced a vision of the British uplands as sublime natural theatre, a landscape of grandeur and romance that formed the spiritual backdrop to a rapidly industrializing society, hungry for nature, experience as compensation for the ugliness of the mill towns and the coal fields. The bare mountain, the empty moor, the rushing stream, these became the symbols of a nature that was valued precisely because it was not the nature of the lowland agricultural landscape, not cultivated, not tamed, not bounded by hedgerow and ditch. But the cultural significance of this romantic vision should not blind us to the extent to which it was, in ecological terms, a misunderstanding. The bare mountain was not primeval, the empty moor was not natural. The rushing stream, with its unstable banks and its flashy hydrograph and its depleted fish populations, was the product of a catchment stripped of the trees and peat bogs that would have regulated its flow and absorbed its peaks. The Romantic sublime was constructed on an ecological catastrophe, and the emotional resonance that generations of British people have found in these landscapes is real and valid and important. But it cannot be allowed to prevent the honest reckoning with what those landscapes are and what they were. The poet R.S. Thomas, who spent most of his life in Wales and whose poetry engages with the Welsh landscape more profoundly than almost any other writer in the language, understood something of this complexity. His poems about the Welsh hill farms are full of a bleak beauty, a recognition that the poverty and hardship of hill farming life and the bleakness of the overgrazed upland are part of the same story. The hill farmer, in Thomas's poems, is not a romantic figure. He is a figure of endurance, grinding out a living on land that gives back little because it has been taken from so much. Thomas does not sentimentalize the landscape. He sees its beauty and its emptiness together as aspects of the same condition. In Scotland, the poet Sorley MacLean, writing in Gaelic in the mid-20th century, brought to the Highland landscape the perspective of someone whose community had been shaped by the clearances in ways that were still living and present. His great poem Halaig, named for a cleared township on the island of Rasay, is a meditation on absence, on the ghosts of the people who were cleared from the land and who persist in the imagination as trees. In the poem, the cleared people have become birch trees on the hillside, and the birch trees are the cleared people. The image is precise. Birch is the pioneer woodland species that would naturally colonize the cleared hillsides if the grazing pressure were lifted. The people and the trees belong together on the land, and both have been removed from it. This is perhaps the most important insight that the cultural history of the British uplands offers. The clearance of the people and the clearance of the trees are not separate stories. They are aspects of the same economic and cultural process. The logic that saw crofting communities as an inefficient use of the highland landscape, obstacles to the profitable management of sheep walks and deer forests, is the same logic that sees woodland as an obstacle to agricultural production. Both involve the reduction of ecological and cultural complexity to a simpler, more manageable, more economically legible condition. Both involve the imposition of external economic values on landscapes whose existing complexity and heterogeneity are not recognized as valuable. The cleared townships of the highlands, the names on the old maps that now mark nothing but grass ridges in the heather and the lost woodlands of the uplands, the pollen records, and the cliff face fragments that are all that remain of the Caledonian forest and the Welsh oak woods, are monuments to the same kind of thinking. The thinking that says that land is valuable only insofar as it produces things that can be measured and sold, and that whatever stands in the way of that production can be removed. The people and the trees stood in the way. The people were moved. The trees were cut. What remains is the simplified landscape of the sheep walk and the grouse moor, managed for the maximum extraction of a single commodity. The concept of rewilding, at its most philosophically ambitious, is a direct challenge to this logic. It says that the complexity itself is valuable, that the ecosystem services provided by diverse, functioning landscapes, the regulation of water, the storage of carbon, the maintenance of soil, the support of biodiversity, are goods that have real economic value, even if they are not currently being paid for in any conventional market. That the reduction of landscape to a single use is not efficiency, but impoverishment. That the restoration of complexity, even partial and imperfect restoration, is worth doing both for its own sake and for the practical benefits it delivers. The economic case for this is becoming clearer, as the costs of not having it become more apparent. The floods that have caused billions of pounds of damage in upland English and Welsh towns over the past 2 decades are substantially a product of the upland landscape condition. Water that falls on bare, grazed moorland runs off rapidly into stream systems. It does not soak into the soil because the soil structure has been degraded by centuries of overgrazing. It does not accumulate in peat bogs because the peat bogs have been drained or damaged. It does not pass through woodland because there is no woodland. It flows straight into the rivers, which rise rapidly, and downstream communities flood. The calculations that hydrologists and water engineers have made about the flood amelioration value of upland woodland restoration and peat bog restoration are striking. A substantial increase in upland woodland cover across the catchments of rivers like the Eden, the Severn, the Wye, the Ouse, and the Tay, combined with the restoration of upland peat bogs as fully functional water-storing systems, could significantly reduce the flood risk to downstream towns and cities. The costs of this restoration would, in many cases, be substantially less than the costs of the flood defences that are currently being built and maintained to protect those towns. Carbon storage is the other economic argument. Healthy peat bogs are among the most effective long-term carbon stores on Earth. A deep peat bog that has been accumulating for 8,000 years contains an enormous quantity of carbon in the form of partially decomposed organic matter. The degraded peat bogs of the British uplands, drained for agriculture or afforestation, or simply dried out by the absence of the bog sphagnum mosses that would maintain their waterlogged condition in the face of climate change, are releasing that stored carbon rather than storing more. The restoration of peat bog hydrology, allowing the sphagnum to re-establish and the bog to return to actively accumulating peat, is one of the most cost-effective carbon sequestration measures available in the UK. The reforestation of upland slopes with native woodland species also sequesters carbon, though on different timescales and in different forms. Trees are relatively slow carbon accumulators in the early decades of their growth, but as woodlands mature and develop their full structural complexity, including the soil carbon stored in the deep root systems and the organic matter of the woodland floor, the long-term carbon storage value becomes very significant. An ancient Caledonian pinewood, or a centuries-old sessile oakwood sequesters and stores far more carbon than a young plantation or a bare moorland, and it does so while also delivering all the other ecosystem services that come with mature native woodland. These are not abstract arguments. They are the reasons why the UK government has committed to significant increases in woodland cover as part of its net zero carbon strategy, and why the new agricultural subsidy frameworks in England, Wales, and Scotland are all moving at different speeds and with different levels of ambition toward payment for ecosystem services rather than payment for food production. The ecological restoration of the British uplands is not just an environmental aspiration, it is an economic necessity, a public health intervention, and a climate policy instrument. But let us not reduce this story entirely to economics and policy, because there is another dimension that matters just as much. There is the question of what it does to a culture to live surrounded by a damaged landscape that it mistakes for a natural one. What it does to the human sense of place, of belonging, of connection to the living world, to have grown up in a landscape that looks and feels like wilderness, but contains almost nothing of the ecological richness and complexity that wilderness implies. Britain has some of the most nature-deprived countryside in the developed world, not just in terms of species abundance and diversity, which are genuinely among the lowest in Europe, but in terms of the lived experience of nature that most British people have access to. The average British person sees far fewer wild animals in a year than the average person in most comparable European countries. The bird populations of the British countryside have crashed over the past 50 years. The insects are in catastrophic decline. The wildflowers of traditional unimproved grassland are largely confined to fragments and nature reserves. The experience of encountering wild nature in any abundant and complex form is, for most British people, something that requires a special trip, a designated reserve, a managed visitor experience. This is not a trivial problem. The growing body of research on the psychological and physical health benefits of contact with nature tells us that exposure to diverse, complex natural environments is genuinely good for human well-being. It reduces stress, it improves attention and cognitive function. It generates feelings of connectedness and belonging that are antidotes to the isolation and alienation that characterize much of modern urban life. A landscape that looks like nature, but functions as a simplified agricultural system, does not deliver these benefits to the same degree as a genuinely complex and biodiverse environment. The nature writer Robert Macfarlane, in his book The Wild Places, explored the few genuinely wild places that remain in Britain, and argued for their importance not just as habitat for rare species, but as essential counterweights to the domesticated, humanized, controlled landscape that constitutes most of the British experience of land. His argument was contested by others who felt that any honest assessment of the British uplands had to acknowledge their managed, damaged character rather than aestheticizing them as wild. But both arguments contain truth. The remaining fragments of genuine wildness in Britain, however small and however compromised, do matter enormously. And the managed, damaged landscape that surrounds them is exactly that. Managed and damaged. Not pristine, not wild, not what it was. What it was. The phrase bears repeating. The British uplands are not what they were. They are not the sum of their geological history alone. They are the product of their geological history combined with the 6,000 years of human action that have transformed the living cover of those ancient rocks beyond recognition. The rocks are real. The mountains, in the geological sense, are real. But the landscape as an ecological system, as a functioning network of species and processes, is a shadow of what it was, maintained in its current simplified state, by a combination of overgrazing and burning and drainage and shooting, and the ongoing failure to recognize degradation as degradation. The specific case of Snowdon, Ir Wydfa in Welsh, the highest peak in Wales and England, illustrates this with particular clarity. Snowdon is famous for its dramatic scenery, its jagged ridges and glacial CWMs, the quality of light on its rock faces, the views from its summit. It is visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year, many of them walking the various routes to the summit along well-maintained paths. It is, by any conventional measure, a beautiful and impressive mountain. But look at the ground between the paths. Look at the vegetation on the hillsides above the visitor centre. It is dominated by mat grass, Nardus stricta, a species that takes over on heavily grazed, nutrient-poor upland soils and forms a dense, uniform, pale-coloured sward that almost nothing else can penetrate. Mat grass is to upland ecology roughly what knotweed is to riverbanks, an indicator of a system that has been pushed so far out of balance that the normal diversity of species cannot re-establish. Mat grass dominance is a symptom of severe ecological degradation. On the cliff faces of Snowdon, inaccessible to sheep, there is a different story. Here, where grazing pressure has never reached, the vegetation is a complex mosaic of Arctic alpine plants, some of them rare species found nowhere else in Wales, or in some cases, nowhere else in Britain. The Snowdon lily, a tiny delicate plant with white petals that flowers in early summer on the ledges of the highest cliffs, is one of the most specialized upland plants in Britain, a relict of the Arctic alpine flora that colonized the country after the last ice age. It survives on Snowdon precisely because it lives on ledges that sheep cannot reach. If you could somehow graze the whole of Snowdon with the same intensity as the accessible slopes, the Snowdon lily would be gone within a generation. The lesson of the cliff faces applies more broadly. The plants and animals that have survived in the British uplands are, with very few exceptions, survivors by virtue of inaccessibility rather than by virtue of any protection or management. They have survived on ledges, in gorges, on islands, in fenced nature reserves, in the few areas where the terrain has been too difficult or too wet or too remote for grazing animals to reach. They are the remnants, the random survivors of a landscape-scale process of simplification that has been running for 6,000 years and is still running, slowly, year by year, through overgrazing and drainage and burning. The Dartmoor uplands of Devon, the southern outlier of the British upland system, are among the most dramatic examples of this process. Dartmoor is a granite batholith, a mass of igneous rock intruded into the surrounding sedimentary rocks and then exposed by erosion that rises to over 600 meters at its highest points and covers an area of about 950 square kilometers. The characteristic landscape of Dartmoor, the open moorland with its granite tors, the bogs and mires of the high plateau, the steep-sided valleys cutting through to the surrounding lowlands, is ancient in geological terms, but recent in ecological terms. The open moorland that most people think of as the defining character of Dartmoor only became established after the Neolithic and Bronze Age clearances. Before then, Dartmoor was forested up to its highest points, as the pollen record from the blanket peat of the high moor clearly shows. The Bronze Age settlement of Dartmoor was extensive and, by the standards of the time, intensive. The remains of Bronze Age field systems, hut circles, and stone rows are preserved under the peat of the high moor in extraordinary numbers. These are among the best preserved prehistoric field systems in Europe, a fact that makes Dartmoor an irreplaceable archaeological resource, but it is worth remembering what these field systems represent. They represent the clearance and cultivation of land that had previously been forested and the subsequent degradation of that cleared land as the Bronze Age climate cooling made upland agriculture non-viable. The archaeology and the ecology are telling the same story. This land was transformed by human action, and the transformation has been maintained by grazing and burning ever since. The Pennines, the long spine of upland that runs from the Peak District in the south to the Cheviots in the north, following the watershed between the rivers draining east to the North Sea and those draining west to the Irish Sea, present a different chapter of the same story. The Pennines are the drainage divide of northern England, and their condition matters enormously for the water quality and flood risk of some of the most densely populated regions of Britain. The rivers that drain the Pennines, the Calder and the Aire and the Wharfe and the Ribble and the Eden and the Tyne, flow through or past cities and towns that are home to millions of people. The upland peat of the Pennines is in a seriously degraded state. Decades of atmospheric pollution from the industrial cities of Lancashire and Yorkshire deposited acid rain on the moorlands, killing the sphagnum moss that maintains peat bog hydrology and leaving large areas of bare, eroding peat. The burning of heather on grouse moors, when it is done too frequently or in dry conditions, also damages peat structure and releases stored carbon. The deep gullies that cut into the peat surface on many Pennine moors, some of them several meters deep, and cutting through thousands of years of accumulated organic matter, are visible evidence of the ongoing erosion and degradation of a carbon store and water regulation system that took 8,000 years to build and is being destroyed in decades. The restoration of Pennine blanket peat is one of the largest and most expensive ecological restoration projects in Britain. It involves the revegetation of bare peat surfaces with sphagnum and other bog plants, the blocking of drainage grips to raise the water table, and in some cases the physical reshaping of eroded peat gullies to reduce sediment loss. It is slow and expensive work, and it is happening against a background of continued managed burning on parts of the moors that makes restoration efforts harder and slower. The Peak District, at the southern end of the Pennines and straddling the boundary between the Dark Peak Millstone Grit uplands and the White Peak Limestone Plateau, has seen significant restoration effort in recent years, not least through the work of the Moors for the Future Partnership, which has spent many millions of pounds revegetating bare peat on the Dark Peak moors. The difference between a restored bog surface, covered in green sphagnum and cotton grass, and a bare eroding peat face, is visually dramatic and ecologically fundamental. The restored surface is storing water, building carbon, stabilizing the peat, and providing habitat for the specialist invertebrates and birds that depend on functioning bog systems. The bare peat is doing none of these things. The Lake District fells present yet another variation on the theme. The Lake District is perhaps the most intensively studied and most visited upland landscape in Britain. It was the inspiration for the Romantic movement's engagement with wild landscape. It was Wordsworth's home and the subject of his most important poetry. It is the setting for Beatrix Potter's children's books. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it is, from an ecological standpoint, one of the most overgrazed, species-poor, and ecologically degraded upland areas in Britain. The Herdwick sheep that graze the Lake District fells are themselves a significant piece of cultural heritage. They are a breed of extraordinary toughness and character, adapted over centuries to the specific conditions of the Cumbrian fells, capable of surviving harsh winters on the open mountain without supplementary feeding, with a homing instinct so strong that the sheep remain on the same area of fell, passed from flock to flock with the tenancy of each farm. They are bred into the landscape in a way that is almost unique. But their grazing pressure, maintained at densities that have increased significantly since the post-war introduction of agricultural subsidies, has reduced the fells to a condition that the ecologist and writer George Monbiot has described as a sheep-grazed desert. The word desert may seem extreme when applied to a landscape that most people find beautiful, but in ecological terms, it is not inaccurate. A desert is a landscape with low biological productivity and low species diversity, and by those measures, the close-grazed Lake District fells qualify. The sward on most of the accessible fell is dominated by a handful of grass species, principally bent grass and mat grass, with very little diversity of forb or shrub. The bird populations are impoverished compared to what comparable upland habitats support in mainland Europe. The invertebrate fauna is limited by the structural simplicity of the vegetation. Some areas of the Lake District are beginning to change. The National Trust, which owns large areas of the Central Fells, has been reducing its sheep numbers and experimenting with rewilding on some of its land. At Haweswater, the most remote and least visited of the Lake District lakes, a major rewilding project is underway, involving the fencing of riparian land to allow woodland regeneration along the riverbanks, the restoration of peat bog on the catchment, and the reduction of sheep numbers on the surrounding fells. The changes are already visible in the diversity of the vegetation and the return of species that had been absent from the area for decades. The red squirrel population at Haweswater is increasing. Dippers and grey wagtails are more abundant in the recovering riverside woodland. The river itself, its banks stabilized by tree roots, its hydrograph moderated by the peat bog restoration upstream, is beginning to look like a river that functions as it should. These stories of recovery, multiplied across dozens of projects across Britain's uplands, are the most hopeful dimension of a story that is otherwise largely one of loss. They demonstrate that the capacity for ecological recovery has not been destroyed by 6,000 years of damage. The seeds are in the soil, the species are in the fragments. The processes that create complexity and diversity and abundance are ready to work, if only the pressure that has suppressed them can be lifted. The timeline of that recovery is not a human timeline, it is an ecological timeline. If the grazing pressure on the Scottish Highlands were significantly reduced tomorrow, and if the deer populations were brought down to a level compatible with natural regeneration, the first visible change would come within 5 years, as scrub and pioneer woodland began to establish on the lower slopes. Within 20 years, young woodland would be spreading up the hillsides. Within a century, substantial areas of native woodland would have re-established. Within 3 centuries, the beginnings of structural complexity that characterizes a functioning forest, the diversity of tree sizes and ages, the fallen timber on the forest floor, the deep shade under mature canopy, would be emerging. Within a millennium, something approaching the Caledonian forest in its pre-clearance character might exist across substantial areas of the Scottish Highlands. A millennium, 40 generations of human beings, longer than the period since the Norman conquest. It is a timescale that sits outside conventional political and economic planning entirely. No minister, no shareholder, no electorate works on a 1,000-year horizon. This is part of why ecological restoration of the scale required is so difficult to achieve. The benefits are real, but they are long-term. The costs are immediate. The political economy of environmental policy systematically discounts the future in favor of the present, and the interests of the living in favor of the unborn. And yet the peat bogs themselves tell us that 1,000-year timescales are real and consequential. The peat that is stored in the blanket bogs of the Scottish flow country accumulated over 8,000 years. It represents 8,000 years of biological productivity, 8,000 years of climate regulation, 8,000 years of water storage, compressed into a layer of organic matter that can be destroyed in a single season of deep ploughing. The geological record tells us that the mountains themselves are the products of processes operating over hundreds of millions of years. The ecological record tells us that the forests that clothed those mountains built their complexity over thousands of years. We are the heirs of all that time. We stand on the accumulated work of deep history every time we walk on an upland soil. The rocks beneath our feet were formed before the first fish swam in the sea. The peat around our boots contains the pollen of trees that died before the first pharaoh ruled in Egypt. The landscape we walk through, degraded as it is, still carries the signature of processes that are older than anything we can meaningfully comprehend. To understand this is not to be paralyzed by the scale of it. It is to be positioned correctly in relation to it. We did not make this landscape in any deep sense. We modified its surface dramatically and damagingly. We can modify it again, more gently, more intelligently, in directions that restore some of what was lost. We cannot reverse deep time. We cannot recreate the Caledonian mountains or the wildwood or the megafauna of the Pleistocene, but we can stop the damage that is still continuing. We can remove the grazing pressure that prevents woodland regeneration. We can restore the peat bogs that regulate water and store carbon. We can allow the rivers to find their own levels and create their own channels. We can bring back the beaver and perhaps in time other species whose absence has left holes in the ecological fabric that no management intervention can fill. This is not nostalgia. It is not a desire to recreate the past or to dismiss the human history of these landscapes as simply destructive. The hill farmers, and the crofters, and the gamekeepers, and the foresters, and all the other people who have made their lives in the British uplands over the centuries have their own valid relationship to these places, their own knowledge, and their own attachment. Their knowledge, particularly the traditional ecological knowledge, encoded in the farming practices and place names and seasonal rhythms of upland communities, is itself a resource that the rewilding of these landscapes should draw on rather than dismiss. But the honest baseline is not the current condition of the landscape. The honest baseline is what we know, from the geological and palynological and archaeological record, about what this landscape was before human action transformed it. And what that record tells us is unambiguous. The mountains of Britain are ancient rocks, exposed by erosion, that were covered for thousands of years in a complex native woodland that has been almost entirely destroyed. The bare hillsides are not wild. The open moorland is not natural. The rushing, flashy rivers are not clean. The silence of the deer forest is not the silence of wilderness. It is the silence of absence, the silence of a system that has been simplified beyond the point of ecological function. The mountains are still there. The rocks are there, old beyond imagining. The capacity for recovery is there, suppressed but not destroyed. And the knowledge of what was lost, written in the pollen grains of the peat bogs, and the genes of the surviving species, and the place names in Gaelic and Welsh and Norse and English that encode a landscape of far greater complexity and richness than the one we see today, is there too. That knowledge is the beginning of a different relationship to this land. It is the beginning of the possibility that the story of the British uplands does not have to end where it is. That the mountains, stripped of their forests by the axes and the sheep and the fire of 6,000 years, might yet, in the long fullness of ecological time, grow green again. The mountains of Britain are not what you think they are. They are older and more complicated and more damaged and more recoverable than the bare and beautiful skyline suggests. They are a record, a wound, and a possibility. They are what is left of something that was cut down, and they contain, still, the seed of what could grow back. The question of rewilding also forces us to confront something uncomfortable about the British conservation movement itself, which has for much of its history focused on managing existing habitats for existing species, rather than on the larger question of what those habitats should be in the first place. British conservation has been enormously successful at protecting fragments, at maintaining the populations of rare and declining species in carefully managed nature reserves. It has built on the tradition of natural history observation and recording that stretches back to Gilbert White and before, a tradition of extraordinary depth and seriousness that has given Britain one of the best documented wildlife records of any country in the world. But this tradition of species-focused, fragment-focused conservation has sometimes obscured the larger ecological picture. When the focus is on maintaining the existing condition of a designated site, there is a structural tendency to resist change, because change, including the natural ecological change that would move a degraded habitat toward a more complex and functional one, looks like a threat to what is currently there. The nature reserve, fenced and managed and monitored, becomes an endpoint rather than a waypoint. The depleted ecosystem it contains is treated as the baseline rather than as the bottom of a recovery trajectory. The rewilding perspective inverts this logic. Instead of asking what species can we maintain in this fragment, it asks what processes can we restore to allow this landscape to move toward greater complexity and function. Instead of defining the endpoint in advance and managing toward it, it allows natural processes to define the endpoint, with human intervention limited to the removal of the factors, principally overgrazing, that are preventing those processes from working. The result is unpredictable in its detail but knowable in its direction, toward more complexity, more diversity, more abundance. This shift in perspective is not easy for a conservation movement that has built its identity and its funding base around the management of specific species and habitats. But it is increasingly necessary, both because the scale of ecological restoration required in Britain is far beyond what can be achieved through the labor-intensive management of nature reserves, and because the climate crisis is changing the conditions in which all conservation management operates in ways that make the current system of managing for specific fixed endpoints increasingly untenable. Climate change is already affecting the British uplands in measurable ways. The snowpack on Scottish mountains is declining. The timing of biological events, the first flowering of upland plants, the arrival of migratory birds, the emergence of insects, is shifting. Species ranges are moving northward and to higher altitudes. The ecological communities of the uplands are already in motion, responding to changing temperature and precipitation patterns in ways that will only accelerate through the coming decades. Managing for the current condition of these habitats is, in this context, not just ecologically insufficient, it is practically impossible. The condition is changing whether we manage for it or not. The restoration of native woodland and the recovery of peat bog hydrology in the British uplands would not make these landscapes immune to climate change. Nothing can do that. But it would make them more resilient to it, more capable of absorbing and buffering the changes that are coming, more able to support the northward and altitudinal shifts in species ranges that climate change requires. A complex, diverse, structurally rich landscape has far more capacity to adapt to changing conditions than a simplified, degraded, monoculture landscape. The former has many options, the latter has very few. This is the final argument for the restoration of the British uplands, the argument from uncertainty. We do not know exactly how climate change will unfold across these landscapes over the coming century. We do not know exactly which species will be affected and how. We do not know exactly what the rainfall patterns, the temperature extremes, the storm frequencies of a warmer Britain will look like in detail. What we know is that more complex ecosystems are more resilient to uncertainty than simpler ones. That diversity is a hedge against the unknown. That the capacity for self-organization and adaptation that a functioning native woodland possesses is something no management plan, however sophisticated, can replicate. The mountains of Britain are old enough to have survived continental collision and oceanic formation and ice ages and everything that evolution and geological time have thrown at them. The ecological communities that these ancient rocks supported were complex and resilient enough to have persisted through millennia of climate variability before human action disrupted them so thoroughly. There is something in the deep history of this landscape, written in the rocks and the peat and the surviving fragments of native species, that knows how to survive. We have, for 6,000 years, been preventing that knowledge from expressing itself. The most hopeful thing we can do now is to begin, carefully and thoughtfully, and with full respect for the human communities whose lives are bound up with these landscapes, to get out of the way. There is a specific quality to the light in the British uplands at certain times of year that deserves attention, because it is part of why these landscapes hold such power over the people who know them, and because understanding that quality of light is also part of understanding what has been lost. In late October and November, when the bracken has turned to copper and the heather is past its flowering and the grasses are pale gold in the low sun, the upland British landscape has a colour and a luminosity that is genuinely extraordinary. The light in the Scottish Highlands in October, or on the Welsh hills in late November, has a quality that painters have struggled with for 2 centuries without fully capturing it. It is not the bright clarity of Mediterranean light or the golden warmth of afternoon sun in a temperate lowland. It is something subtler and stranger, a diffused, refracted light that seems to come from many directions at once, that picks out the textures of heather and grass and rock with a delicacy that direct sunlight would overwhelm. This quality of light is partly a function of the moisture in the upland atmosphere. The British uplands are wet, consistently, persistently wet, and the moisture in the air at altitudes of 300 to 600 meters creates a particular optical character that softens shadows and extends the visible range of color. But it is also a function of the vegetation itself, or rather of the absence of vegetation. A bare hillside, reflecting light off a million angled surfaces of grass, stem and heather twig and exposed rock, produces a diffused luminosity that a forested slope would not. The light in an ancient woodland is a very different thing, filtered through layers of leaf and branch, concentrated in shafts where it breaks through, absorbed by the dark surfaces of bark and moss, and the deep shadow under dense canopy. Both qualities of light are real, and both are beautiful. The open upland light of October is not inferior to the dappled woodland light of June, but the open upland light of October in the British Hills is the light of a landscape that has been cleared. The woodland light of June is the light of a landscape that is functioning as it should. To love the one does not require dismissing the other, but to insist that the open light is more authentic, more natural, more truly what this landscape is supposed to look like, is to mistake the condition for the original. The cultural history of British landscape painting illuminates this confusion in interesting ways. The great tradition of British landscape art, from the 18th century watercolourists through Constable and Turner and the Victorian painters, is overwhelmingly a tradition of open landscapes. Constable's Suffolk is the cleared agricultural lowland. Turner's mountain subjects are spectacular, bare ridgelines and dramatic weather effects over open water and rock. The Lake District painters of the early 19th century depicted a landscape already stripped of its forest cover. The Scottish Highland painters of the Victorian period, the Landseer tradition of stag and mountain and loch, depicted a landscape that the clearances had recently emptied of both people and trees. There is in the British landscape art tradition almost no representation of dense native woodland as a positive aesthetic experience. Woodland is occasionally present as a backdrop or a frame, but the great vistas, the compositional coups, the images that have shaped the British visual relationship to landscape are almost invariably open landscapes. Forest, in British cultural imagination, tends to be associated with danger, with darkness, with the unknown, with the fairy tale wilderness that children and heroes get lost in. The open landscape, by contrast, is legible, safe, surveillable, productive. The cultural preference for open landscape over woodland is not just an aesthetic preference. It reflects deep historical attitudes to land and its use. This cultural preference may also reflect, at a level below conscious articulation, the guilt of the destroyer. If your relationship to the land is shaped by the fact that your ancestors stripped it of its trees, you may find it psychologically difficult to value trees as landscape elements, because their absence is the condition of everything you have built on that land. The open landscape is the proof of your investment, your labor, your ownership. The tree is the thing you removed. To want it back is to question the legitimacy of everything that its removal made possible. This is speculative, but the depth of cultural resistance to woodland in the British uplands suggests that something more than mere aesthetic preference is at work. The fierceness of the reaction against rewilding in some farming communities, the language of invasion and colonization that is sometimes used about the spread of woodland and scrub on agricultural land, suggests an emotional charge that goes beyond practical concerns about land use and economics. The tree is not just a management problem. In some psychological register, it is a reproach. The indigenous peoples of North America, Australia, and other parts of the world who have maintained or are recovering their relationship to their ancestral lands speak of the land as a teacher, as a relation, as something with agency and voice that speaks to those who have learned to listen. This way of relating to land is deeply foreign to the mainstream British cultural tradition, which has for centuries treated land primarily as a resource to be managed and exploited. But there are echoes of a different relationship in the older British traditions, in the place names in Gaelic and Welsh and Norse that record a detailed and intimate knowledge of landscape features, in the agricultural and ecological knowledge encoded in traditional hill farming practices, in the landscape poetry of poets like R.S. Thomas and Seamus Heaney and Norman MacCaig, who writes about the Scottish landscape with a precision and attention that goes beyond mere description. Norman MacCaig, walking in the Assynt Hills of Sutherland in the mid-20th century, and writing about them in poems of extraordinary clarity and care, was aware of the historical dimension of the landscape he loved. He knew the cleared townships. He knew the geological age of the rocks. He knew the names of the plants in the moorland and the names of the birds overhead, and the names of the lochs and the hills in Gaelic and English, and sometimes in both simultaneously, carrying different meanings, different histories, in each language. His poems are not naive celebrations of a pristine wilderness. They are meditations on a landscape that has been shaped by time and human action alike, that carries its history in its vegetation and its geology and its place names. To read McCaig in Ascent is to understand something about the British uplands that neither the romantic tradition nor the ecological science alone can convey. The landscape is real and present and beautiful and damaged and historical and geological, all at once, simultaneously. To look at a bare hillside above a Sutherland loch, with all of this knowledge active, is to see something more complex and more moving than either the uninformed tourist who sees only the grand scenery or the ecologist who sees only the moving degradation. That complexity of seeing is what this kind of history is for, not to make you feel guilty about what your ancestors did to the British landscape, not to make you refuse to love the heather and the bracken and the ridge in the winter light, but to make you love it with full knowledge, to love it as it is, damaged and beautiful, rather than as it is imagined to be, pristine and wild. To understand that you are standing on the ruins of something greater, and that the ruins are worth caring for, and that the something greater is not entirely gone, and that the future of these hills and mountains is not fixed. The geological processes that built and eroded the mountains of Britain are still running, infinitely slowly by human standards but real and continuous. The rivers are still carrying rock to the sea. The frost is still prizing fragments from cliff faces. The peat is still accumulating in the few intact bogs that remain. The seeds of native trees are still falling to the ground, still germinating, still reaching for the light, still being eaten by deer and sheep before they can establish. The process is still happening. The landscape is not static. It is not finished. It is in the middle of a story whose end is not yet written. What that story becomes depends on what we decide to do next. Not just in terms of land management policy, though that matters enormously, but in terms of how we understand these places and what we value about them. If we go on misunderstanding the upland British landscape as natural wilderness, we will go on managing it in ways that confirm that misunderstanding, and the damage will continue and compound. If we begin to understand it as the ecological aftermath of a long history of clearance, we create the possibility of a different kind of management, one that works with ecological processes rather than against them, that values complexity rather than simplicity, that takes seriously the long-term cost of the short-term decisions that have brought us to this point. The mountains of Britain are not what they seem. They are not mountains in the fullest sense. They are not wilderness. They are not ancient in the ecological sense, even when they are ancient in the geological sense. They are the bare and eroded and overgrazed remnants of something that was once much richer and more alive and more complex. They are beautiful, genuinely, in the way that is specific to them, the austere beauty of an emptied landscape in the clear upland light. But they are also a record of loss, a 6,000-year story of ecological diminishment that is told in the pollen grains of the peat bogs and the place names of the cleared townships and the fragments of surviving woodland on the cliff faces that sheep cannot reach. To stand on a bare Scottish hillside and know all of this is to be in a relationship with the landscape that most people who visit these hills never have. It is to see further than the surface. It is to feel the depth of time that lies below your feet, the geological time of the ancient rocks, and the ecological time of the forests that grew on those rocks, and the people who cleared them. It is to understand that the empty horizon is not the original horizon, that the silence is not the original silence, that the bare hillside you are looking at is an answer to a question that has been asked over and over in different ways by different people for 6,000 years. What is this land for? And to know that the question is still open, that the answer that has been given, the sheep walk and the grouse moor and the deer forest and the Sitka spruce plantation, is not the only possible answer, that there is another answer available, slower and more patient and more demanding, which is to ask what this land was before the question was asked in those terms, and to begin, carefully, imperfectly, in full knowledge of the complexity of the human history that has brought us here, to let that older, richer, more fully alive answer emerge again. What does it sound like? A landscape that has been emptied. This is not a rhetorical question. The acoustic ecologist Bernie Krause has spent decades recording the sounds of natural environments around the world, and one of his most disturbing findings is the degree to which the soundscapes of degraded landscapes differ from those of intact ones. In a functioning ecosystem, sound has what Krause calls biophony, the complex chorus of living things, insects and frogs and birds, and wind through vegetation that fills every frequency band of the audible spectrum in a continuously shifting, constantly varied pattern. In a degraded ecosystem, the biophony is sparse. There are gaps in the sound spectrum. There are silences where sound should be. Walk on an upland Scottish moor in midsummer. The silence is striking. There are sounds, of course. There is the wind in the heather, the call of a curlew if you are lucky, the alarm call of a meadow pipit, the rush of water in a burn. But compared to what a mature woodland sounds like in the same month, the acoustic landscape of the open moorland is thin. There is no rustle of leaves in hundreds of different shapes and sizes. There is no continuous background buzz of insect activity. There are no woodpeckers, no tree creepers, no nuthatches, no great spotted woodpeckers, no tawny owls calling at dusk, none of the rich texture of sound that a functioning woodland creates. This acoustic poverty is a measure of ecological poverty. Sound is a proxy for biodiversity and ecological function. A landscape that is acoustically rich is one in which many different species are present and active. A landscape that is acoustically thin is one in which the ecological community has been simplified. The upland British moors are acoustically thin because they are ecologically simplified. The sound that is missing is the sound of what should be there. The birdsong of a temperate forest is among the most complex and beautiful acoustic phenomena in the natural world. The dawn chorus in an ancient oak wood in May is an experience that people who have heard it tend to describe in terms that seem excessive until you have heard it yourself. It is not simply loud, it is textured, it has depth. Different species occupy different acoustic niches, different frequencies and rhythms and spatial positions in a way that allows each voice to be individually distinguishable within the whole. The ensemble quality of the woodland dawn chorus is something that no managed landscape, no plantation forest, no urban park, no carefully maintained nature reserve can fully replicate. It is an emergent property of a truly complex ecosystem. Britain has lost most of its woodland songbird populations over the past 50 years, even by the standards of the already depleted populations of the mid-20th century. The willow tit, once common in damp woodland and scrub across Britain, has declined by more than 90%. The lesser spotted woodpecker has declined by 70%. The wood warbler, the pied flycatcher, the redstart, all birds of mature deciduous woodland have declined severely. These declines are occurring across the board, driven by habitat loss and fragmentation, by changes in woodland management, by the loss of the insect populations that these birds depend on for food. The insects. Any discussion of the ecological health of the British countryside eventually arrives at the insects because the invertebrate fauna is both the most diverse component of the ecosystem and the most sensitive indicator of its condition. Britain has lost somewhere around 40% of its insect species abundance over the past 50 years. The so-called windshield effect, the phenomenon of driving a long distance without accumulating the dead insects on a car windscreen that were once so common as to require regular cleaning, is widely noted by people old enough to remember how things were in the 1970s and 1980s. What it represents is a catastrophic decline in flying insect populations, particularly beetles, moths, flies, and the beneficial groups like hoverflies and bees that are essential pollinators. Insects are the foundation of most terrestrial food webs. They are the food of birds, bats, frogs, toads, hedgehogs, and countless other species. They are the decomposers that break down dead plant material and return its nutrients to the soil. They are the pollinators, without which the reproduction of most flowering plants is impossible. A landscape that has lost its insect diversity is not just ecologically impoverished in a direct sense. It is structurally compromised at its most fundamental level. The trophic cascade, the chain of feeding relationships from plant to herbivorous insect, to predatory insect, to small bird, to larger bird, has been broken or weakened at multiple points. The restoration of native woodland in the British uplands would begin to address this insect crisis, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. A mature native oak tree supports more species of invertebrate than any other tree in Britain, over 500 species in some estimates. An oak wood of mature trees, structurally diverse with standing deadwood and fallen timber and diverse ground flora, is one of the richest invertebrate habitats in the British landscape. The contrast with a Sitka spruce plantation, which supports a handful of specialist invertebrates and very little else, or with a close grazed moorland, which supports only the most generalist and tolerant species, could not be more stark. The case for native woodland restoration in the British uplands is not primarily an aesthetic case, though the aesthetics are compelling. It is not primarily an emotional case, though the emotional arguments are powerful. It is primarily a practical case, grounded in the most rigorous ecological science and the most honest economic accounting. The upland landscapes of Britain are providing a tiny fraction of the ecosystem services they should be providing. They are a failing asset, generating small returns from sheep and deer and grouse, while imposing large costs in flooding, water treatment, carbon release, and biodiversity loss that are paid by the public. The restoration of ecological function to these landscapes, principally through the return of native woodland cover and the restoration of peat bog systems, would reverse this situation and deliver genuine and substantial public benefit. The journey from understanding to action is long and difficult in any policy domain, but perhaps especially in land management, where the path dependencies of existing ownership patterns, cultural traditions, and economic arrangements are so deeply embedded. But the understanding is becoming wider and deeper, and the pressure for change is growing. The rewilding movement has shifted the terms of the debate in ways that would have seemed impossible 20 years ago. The concept of paying farmers and landowners for ecosystem services is no longer radical. The return of the beaver is no longer controversial among most people, even if the detail of its management continues to generate heated debate among the farmers and fishermen whose interests it directly affects. And the mountains are still there. The rocks that were formed at the bottom of a deep ocean 500 million years ago, that were thrust to heights comparable to the Himalayas by the collision of continents, that were ground down over 400 million years of erosion to the rounded profiles of the Scottish Highlands and the sharper ridges of Snowdonia and the dome-like summits of the Lake District fells, those rocks are still there. They are patient in a way that nothing human can be. They have waited through continental drift and oceanic openings and ice ages, and the entire rise and fall of human civilization, and they will wait through whatever comes next. What has changed and what can change is what lives on those rocks. The ancient stone is the given, the living cover is the variable. And the living cover of the British mountains, stripped and simplified and degraded over 6,000 years of human action, is something that we have the knowledge, and in most cases, the means to begin to restore. Not to what it was, exactly. Not the wildwood of 8,000 years ago, because some of what was lost cannot be recovered in any timescale we can plan for, but towards something more complex, more diverse, more alive, more functional than what exists today. That is the choice the British mountains offer us, not the choice between beauty and ugliness, because both the bare moor and the rewilded hillside have their own beauty, different kinds, but real. Not the choice between culture and nature, because the human history of these landscapes is woven into their ecology in ways that cannot be unpicked. But the choice between continuing to mistake a wound for a wilderness and beginning honestly and carefully and with full respect for the human communities that have made their lives here, to heal it. The mountains are what is left, and what is left is not nothing. It is the base of something that was once much greater and that could, in time and with intention, become greater still.